Welcome, curious minds, to the deep dive. Every single day, it feels like we're navigating this just vast ocean of health information.
It really does.
A new miracle cure pops up, then there's a fresh warning about some hidden danger, and the next day, you've got this parade of, well, self-proclaimed experts all vying for your attention. It can feel totally overwhelming, right?
Absolutely.
How are you, the listener who just wants to be well-informed without, drowning in data, supposed to figure out what's genuinely good for your health and what's just noise?
That's exactly the challenge we're tackling head-on today. Our mission with this deep dive is really to cut through that relentless noise. We've gathered quite a stack of sources, everything from rigorous scientific studies, randomized controlled trials, you name it,
Right.
all the way to those compelling, often pretty charismatic claims made by influencers and, popular figures.
Yeah.
Our goal here is to unpack all of it for you, to try and give you the clearest, most evidence-based picture of what truly matters for your health and, really crucially, your longevity. We want to equip you with the tools to critically evaluate information yourself.
Yeah, so you can focus your energy, your resources on what actually works.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And trust me, we're going to cover a lot of ground today. We'll look at everything from, say, the diet sodas you might be sipping every afternoon, to those really expensive green powders that you see celebrities pushing, to the whole world of these high-profile biohackers, and even the latest weight loss drugs that are, well, dominating the headlines.
Big topic right now.
Huge. We'll unearth some genuinely surprising facts, stuff that might completely flip your perspective.
Yeah.
And yes, we will definitely be debunking some let's say, very costly myths that are floating around out there. So get ready to take a deep breath and dive in with us.
Okay, so to start, let's maybe address a fundamental dynamic in this whole modern health space, that powerful allure of the quick fix.
Oh.
And alongside it, the illusion of expertise. It's incredibly tempting, isn't it, to believe in simple, sometimes almost magical-sounding solutions, especially when they're offered by these really charismatic individuals who promise profound, often rapid results.
Totally.
But the crucial question we always need to ask is, how often do these compelling claims actually hold up under, proper scientific scrutiny? This is a pattern we're going to see again and again today.
All right, that's where we begin our journey today, starting with something many of us consume pretty regularly, artificial sweeteners.
Oh, yeah.
I bet you've heard the common claims that diet soda makes you crave sugar more, or that it somehow spikes your blood sugar or insulin, even without sugar, or even that it secretly leads to weight gain despite having 0 calories.
Heard them all.
And of course, there's always that nagging anxiety about potential cancer links, especially with something like aspartame. It feels like every time I reach for a sugar-free drink, someone's ready with a warning.
It's true. Those claims are really widespread. Let's maybe tackle the blood sugar and insulin hypothesis first, because, on the surface, it sounds kind of plausible.
Yes.
The theory goes something like this. Your tongue detects sweetness, sends a signal to your brain, which then tells your pancreas, hey, release some insulin because it's anticipating sugar. Seems like a logical chain of events, right? Like your body's prepping for a sugar rush that never actually arrives.
Yeah, it makes intuitive sense.
Yeah.
So what does the evidence actually say about this supposed insulin response? Does your body really get fooled like that?
Well, a recent randomized control trial looked at this directly. They gave participants plain carbonated water, 2 different kinds of artificially sweetened diet soda, and regular soda. Then they measured their glucose and insulin levels.
Okay.
The results were pretty clear. Only the regular soda caused those glucose and insulin spikes. The diet sodas, nothing significant. And, lots of people, even YouTubers using continuous glucose monitors, have done similar tests at home. They consistently show basically no effect on blood sugar from zero sugar Coke, for example.
Right.
And physiologically speaking, think about it. If insulin were released without any glucose coming in, it would actually paradoxically cause your blood sugar to drop. But we just don't see that happening.
Okay, so that seems to debunk the phantom blood sugar and insulin spike pretty thoroughly. But what about that really persistent claim that diet drinks, even with no calories, still cause weight gain? That one feels really counterintuitive.
It is counterintuitive, but it's a very common belief, and it's been well studied. There's a strong piece of evidence from a 2012 randomized controlled trial published in Clinical Nutrition.
Okay, what do they find?
They compared overweight subjects who were assigned to drink either regular cola, milk, aspartame-sweetened cola, or just plain water over a period of time. The results for weight gain were quite telling.
Okay.
Milk led to the most weight gain, followed closely by the regular cola, Water resulted in, some modest weight gain. But here's the surprising part. The Diet Cola group, they gained the least weight of all.
Least weight. Less than water, even.
Less than water, yes. And even more significantly, when they look specifically at fat mass, regular cola led to the highest fat gain. But the Diet Cola group was the only group to actually lose fat mass.
Wow, that's a huge plot twist.
Mhm.
So Diet Cola was linked with less weight gain and even fat loss compared to water and other calorie drinks in that study. What about other health markers? Did they look at those?
They did. And from a metabolic health perspective, the Diet Cola group actually showed improvements. They had the largest reduction in total cholesterol, and they were the only group to actually reduce their fasting plasma glucose and insulin levels.
So it looked like it was improving markers of metabolic syndrome.
Exactly. It appeared to be doing just that. So, on the balance of evidence, if you're standing there choosing between a sugary drink and a sugar-free one, the sugar-free option really appears to be the better choice for managing weight and metabolic health based on this kind of data.
And really shifts the conventional wisdom for a lot of people, I think. Now, okay, we can't talk about artificial sweeteners without tackling the elephant in the room,
Yeah.
the cancer concerns.
Right.
This really blew up when the World Health Organization got involved, didn't it?
It did indeed. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, that's IARC, classified aspartame as possibly carcinogenic to humans, putting it in Group 2B,
Yeah.
and that certainly caused a stir.
Understandably.
However, it's really crucial to understand the context here. IARC classifications are based on the strength of evidence that something could potentially cause cancer, not necessarily how likely it is to cause cancer in real-world exposure scenarios.
Okay, so strength of evidence, not likelihood. What does Group 2B actually mean then?
Group 2B means there's either limited but not convincing evidence in humans or convincing evidence in lab animals, usually from rodent studies, often at very high doses.
Limited but not convincing sounds.
Well, pretty equivocal. I remember seeing a list of other things in Group 2B around that time, and it was quite eye-opening. What kind of company is aspartame keeping in that category?
It really puts it into perspective, doesn't it? Other items also classified in Group 2B include things like aloe vera extract, bracken fern, certain pickled Asian vegetables, even the occupational exposure experienced during dry cleaning.
Wow. Aloe vera, pickled vegetables, dry cleaning.
Okay. So when you hear possibly carcinogenic, it's really important to understand it's not in the same league as, say, asbestos or smoking, which are in much, much higher risk categories with strong human evidence.
That definitely makes it sound far less alarming. And then there's the question of dose, right? How much is actually considered too much? What's the acceptable daily intake for aspartame? Right. The dose makes the poison, as they say. The WHO recommends an acceptable daily intake, or ADI, of 40 milligrams per kilogram of body weight per day.
Okay, 40 milligrams per kilogram. What does that look like in real terms for an average person?
Well, for an average 75-kilogram person, that's about 165 pounds, that works out to approximately 3,000 milligrams per day.
3,000 milligrams. How much is in a typical diet soda?
To put that into perspective, a can of Coke Zero has around 85 milligrams of aspartame,
85 milligrams.
which means a 75-kilogram person could technically consume over 30 cans a day and still remain within that recommended safe limit.
Over 30 cans. That's an astronomical amount. Nobody's drinking that much diet soda, surely.
Highly unlikely.
But what about human studies? I remember there was one from France that got a lot of press. Did that show a stronger link?
Yes, you're likely thinking of an observational study that followed roughly 100,000 French adults over about 8 years. That study did show a weak association between artificially sweetened beverages and overall cancer risk, with what's called a hazard ratio of 1.13.
Okay, 1.13. So there was an association, but you emphasized weak. What does that hazard ratio actually mean for an individual's risk, like in plain English?
It's really important to contextualize these numbers. A hazard ratio of, say, 1.1 represents a 10% increase in relative risk. Now, in a population where the baseline cancer risk might be, let's say, 0.05% per year,
Okay.
an HR of 1.1 would increase that risk to 0.055% per year. It's a tiny absolute increase. Now, compare that to smoking and lung cancer, which has a hazard ratio closer to 14.
14. That's a 1,400% increase.
Exactly, a 1,400% increase. The tiny increase seen with artificially sweetened beverages in that French study is, frankly, easily explained by other factors confounding variables, maybe reverse causality, which are common limitations in these types of observational studies.
So people who drink more diet soda might just have other lifestyle factors that slightly increase risk.
Precisely. So overall, when you look at the science, the totality of the evidence, it really suggests that if you're choosing between a sugary drink and a sugar-free one, the sugar-free option seems to be the better choice for your health.
That puts it into a much clearer perspective.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we're trying to manage calories or sugar, sugar-free drinks look like a better bet than the sugary ones.
That seems to be the case, yes. It's about relative risk.
Right. Okay, moving on from diet drinks, let's wade into another um, truly murky area, the supplement maze.
Oh boy.
It feels like every other day there's a new must-have supplement promising everything from boundless energy to a perfect gut. But are we really paying for something beneficial or just, well, what some people call pixie dust or even expensive urine? Let's start with the really big one, athletic greens, now known as AG1.
Ah, AG1. Yes, it's a prime example of a supplement with a, let's say, core issue. Most of its ingredients are hidden within a proprietary blend, meaning the company doesn't disclose the exact quantities of most of the individual ingredients. And without knowing those specific amounts, you, the consumer, simply cannot genuinely know if the product contains enough of any given ingredient to actually make a difference to your health. You don't know the dose.
So you don't really know what you're getting, and I've heard this term pixie dusting used in this context. Can you explain what that is?
Pixie dusting is, well, exactly what it sounds like. Because of FDA labeling regulations, ingredients in a blend must be listed in descending order by weight.
Okay.
So when you look at AG1's label, you'll see things like, well, it contains only about 2 grams of fiber, and that's derived from multiple different sources listed high up. But then the expensive ingredients, the ones with the really impressive health claims attached to them, are listed much, much further down the list.
Implying there's very little of them in there.
Exactly. It tells you that the vast majority of the product, often, 80 to 90%, is probably made up of cheap fillers like apple powder, maybe some spirulina, the expensive good-for-you ingredients. They're likely present in amounts far too low to be clinically effective, literally just a fairy dusting to make the label look good.
And it's a very expensive product, isn't it? If the base ingredients are so cheap, where's all that money going?
You're right to ask. AG1 is now a multi-billion-dollar company. A significant chunk of that price tag goes to profit, of course. But they also spend millions, literally millions each month on advertising, and they offer very high commissions to influencers. How high? Reportedly up to 30% per sale, sometimes with ongoing commissions if someone subscribes through their link. This incentivizes a massive network of influencers to promote AG1, often, without really deep scientific scrutiny. It's a very effective marketing strategy.
Extremely effective, it seems. So, okay, let's talk about the research they do cite to back up their claims. I've heard some pretty strong critiques about their methodology.
Yes, their research practices are indeed problematic. Firstly, AG1 funds its own studies, which immediately introduces a significant risk of bias. You always have to be wary of industry-funded research.
Right, conflict of interest.
Exactly. For instance, their big randomized double-blinded placebo-controlled trial sounds impressive, right?
Sounds like the gold standard.
It should be, but they used maltodextrin as the placebo.
Maltodextrin, isn't that a type of sugar?
It's a processed carbohydrate, and crucially, maltodextrin itself has been shown in other studies to negatively affect the gut microbiome. It can alter populations of good bacteria like lactobacillus and bifidobacterium.
So the placebo wasn't inert. It might have actively harmed the control group's gut health.
Precisely. By using a placebo that might have a negative impact, AG1 superficially appears better in comparison. It's not demonstrating genuine efficacy against a neutral baseline. It's just looking better than something potentially detrimental. It's a clever, but I would argue misleading way to design a study.
That's definitely not a fair comparison. And what about those incredibly high percentages of vitamins you see on the label? Like 500% of your daily vitamin C, or I think it's like 8,000% of B12.
Right, that's where the expensive urine concept comes in. Many of these vitamins, like vitamin C and the B vitamins, are water-soluble, meaning your body can only absorb and utilize a certain amount at any given time. Any excess beyond what your body needs right then and there, it's simply flushed out, primarily through your urine.
So you're literally peeing out the excess.
You are. You're essentially paying a very high price for nutrients that your body can't use and will just excrete. And finally, it's crucial to remember, supplements aren't regulated like medicines. Companies can make these broad, often vague claims like daily support for energy, gut health, as long as they include that little disclaimer, often with an asterisk, saying the FDA hasn't evaluated the claim.
Right, that tiny print. It's quite the maze to navigate, isn't it?
It really is.
And speaking of costly mistakes, let's talk about something that was hailed for years as this miracle anti-aging compound, only to be, well, widely debunked. Resveratrol. This one involves a Harvard professor and, I believe, a staggering $720 million price tag.
Ah, the resveratrol saga. Yes, it's arguably one of the most damaging mistakes in the field of geroscience, the science of aging.
How did it start?
The story really begins back in 1999. A lab partner of David Sinclair, who's a prominent Harvard professor in this field, discovered that overactivating an enzyme called SIR2 in yeast could extend their lifespan pretty significantly.
Okay.
Then, in 2003, Sinclair published a high-profile paper claiming that resveratrol, a compound found in things like red wine grapes, activated the SIR2 enzyme. They used a specific laboratory method, a fluorescent dye assay, to measure this activation.
So it looked like a major breakthrough, right? Something that could potentially lead to a genuine longevity treatment based on activating this longevity gene. But there was a critical flaw in that initial test, wasn't there?
A huge flaw. The critical issue emerged around 2005 when another lab, Matt Kaeberlein's lab actually, tried to replicate Sinclair's findings in living cells, not just in a test tube with a dye. And they found resveratrol simply didn't activate SIR2.
It didn't work in actual cells.
Nope. After a lot of investigation, they discovered that the resveratrol wasn't actually acting on the SIR2 enzyme itself. It was only interfering with the fluorescent dye assay they were using in the test tube. It was causing the dye to release light, making it look like SIR2 was active, but it wasn't actually doing anything to the target protein.
So the entire premise was based on a chemical test tube artifact, as they called it, a lab error.
Exactly. The test was flawed, which made the compound look effective when it wasn't, at least not via that proposed mechanism.
So the very foundation of the claim crumbled. What did Sinclair do when confronted with this debunking? Did he retract or caution against resveratrol?
Well, no. Instead of halting or even pausing research on resveratrol based on this, Sinclair effectively doubled down. In 2006, he published another high-profile paper, this time in the journal Nature, showing that resveratrol improved the health and survival of mice that were fed a high-calorie diet.
Ah, the mouse study. That one got a lot of attention.
It fueled massive hype, especially because it was easily linked in the popular press to the French paradox, that idea that drinking red wine explains why French people have lower heart disease rates despite high-fat diets.
Right. The French paradox always made resveratrol sound so appealing, linking red wine to longevity. But what was the truth about that high-calorie diet they fed the mice in his study? Was it just, like, extra cheese?
Not even close. This is where it becomes even more problematic. The mice in that specific nature study weren't just on a high-calorie diet. They were fed an extremely unnatural, frankly bizarre diet consisting of 60% coconut oil.
60%.
60%. This diet was so unhealthy, it caused their livers to swell up dramatically, so much so that their enlarged livers literally crushed their lungs, which is what ultimately killed many of them.
Good grief.
So it wasn't really a study of normal aging or even a realistic high-fat diet. It was a study of a bizarre pathological process induced by poisoning these mice. And the median lifespan increase they reported was only observed in these poisoned mice compared to other poisoned mice. It was far removed from a normal aging model and certainly not representative of anything related to a healthy human diet.
So not a study about aging, not even about a healthy high-fat diet, but rather about saving mice from dying slightly slower from a specific toxic feeding regimen. And despite the original debunking of the mechanism, this hype then translated into a massive commercial venture.
It did. At the peak of the hype around 2008, David Sinclair co-founded Citrus Pharmaceuticals based on this resveratrol research. And a major pharmaceutical giant, GSK, purchased Citrus for an astonishing $720 million.
$720 million. And this was after the research showing the initial findings were likely a test tube artifact had already been published.
Yes, after Kaeberlein's debunking work was out there. It's quite incredible.
Staggering. What happened to the Citrus Pharmaceuticals in the end? Did they develop any miracle drugs?
No. GSK shut Citrus down just 5 years later, having achieved virtually nothing of clinical significance. And maybe the final nail in the coffin was when the gold standard for longevity drug testing in the U.S., the Interventions Testing Program, which is overseen by the National Institutes of Health.
Okay.
They were actually directed by the NIH director at the time to specifically test resveratrol in healthy mice. Because of all the hype, they tested it thoroughly.
And the results?
They found no longevity benefit whatsoever in healthy, normally aging mice. None. even when they used doses 10 to 30 times higher than Sinclair's original mouse study dose.
Wow. So the highest standard test found nothing. And beyond just being ineffective, was there any evidence that emerged later suggesting resveratrol could actually be harmful?
Disturbingly, yes. A large meta-analysis looked at nearly 170 different experiments on resveratrol and concluded that, on average, it had no effect. Any positive effects seen in some studies were likely due to that original fluorescent dye artifact messing up the measurements.
Okay, no effect on average.
But more concerning for humans, subsequent studies showed it had no beneficial effect on glucose or lipid metabolism. In fact, some research suggested it might even increase total cholesterol and LDL
The
cholesterol.
opposite of what you'd want.
Exactly. And perhaps most worryingly, one study found that taking resveratrol actually blunted the positive cardiovascular effects of exercise training in older men.
It made exercise less effective.
That's what the study suggested. So what started as a potential scientific error fueled by hype and massive investment became a huge commercial endeavor that ultimately showed no benefit and even pointed towards potential harm. A real cautionary tale.
Absolutely. The journey of resveratrol is quite something, highlighting how easily hype can outrun solid science, especially when there's a lot of money and maybe ego involved. And speaking of things that might be more hype than help, let's talk about electrolytes. It feels like suddenly every athlete, every influencer, even major celebrities are launching their own electrolyte drinks. They seem to be rebranding what sounds like a pretty simple fundamental need.
You're right, the marketing around electrolytes has exploded, and it often hinges on a very simple logic. You sweat, you lose salt, therefore you must replace that salt quickly, or, your performance will plummet, you'll cramp up, etc.
Yeah, sounds legit.
On the surface, it sounds entirely reasonable, but the actual science of sweat tells a slightly different, more nuanced story.
How so? Isn't sweat basically just salt and water leaving your body?
Not exactly in those proportions. Crucially, sweat is hypotonic compared to your blood. That means it's less salty than your blood plasma.
Less salty. Okay.
So, when you sweat, you're primarily losing water relative to salt. As that water evaporates from your skin, the salt concentration in your remaining blood actually becomes more concentrated, not less. Think of it like simmering a pot of soup on the stove.
Right, the liquid boils off and the soup gets saltier.
Exactly. Your blood does essentially the same thing when you sweat heavily.
Okay, that's a great analogy. So what does your body do when your blood starts getting saltier from sweating?
Your body has these incredibly robust, inbuilt mechanisms to maintain homeostasis, to keep everything in balance. Your brain has sensors that detect this increase in salt concentration, this osmolality. This triggers two key responses. First, a powerful thirst response. You feel thirsty, you drink water, and that dilutes the salt back down to normal levels. Second, your brain signals your kidneys via antidiuretic hormone or ADH to reabsorb more water back into the bloodstream and produce less urine, conserving water.
So your body automatically tries to dilute the salt and hold on to water.
Precisely. And for most people, in most everyday situations, even moderate exercise, these natural regulatory systems, your thirst mechanism, your kidney function, your hormonal responses, they are more than enough to keep your electrolyte levels perfectly healthy.
So unless you're doing something extreme, like running an ultramarathon in the heat, or maybe fasting for a very long time without any salt intake, most people don't actually need to chug electrolyte supplements.
That's generally correct. Those extreme endurance events or perhaps prolonged fasting scenarios are the rare exceptions where strategically adding a small amount of sodium might be beneficial for maintaining performance or preventing issues like hyponatremia, which is dangerously low sodium, but that's very uncommon.
Okay. But what about those sports drinks like Gatorade? They have salt and sugar. Isn't that about replacing salt?
Well, it's important to understand why salt and glucose are often together in rehydration drinks. It's less about replacing the amount of salt lost and more about enhancing rapid water absorption in the gut.
How does that work?
Your intestines have these clever co-transporters called SGLT1 transporters. They grab onto sodium and glucose together, and when they pull those into your intestinal cells, water follows passively through osmosis. So having both salt and sugar helps pull water into your bloodstream much faster than drinking plain water alone. It's primarily a rapid hydration strategy, not necessarily a salt replacement strategy for most situations.
Ah, okay. So it's about getting water in faster, using salt and sugar as helpers.
Essentially, yes.
Correct.
Especially important during intense, prolonged exercise where dehydration is a major concern.
Got it. And what about the actual potential danger of too much salt? Because lately, it feels like the narrative, especially in some online health circles, has shifted to almost encourage more salt intake, which seems to fly in the face of decades of traditional health advice.
This is a really critical point and frankly a concerning trend. Decades of strong evidence show that excess sodium intake raises blood pressure. Chronically high blood pressure is a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, and strokes. Your body only needs a relatively small amount of sodium to function, maybe around 500 milligrams a day, which is less than a quarter teaspoon of salt. Many major health organizations recommend keeping daily sodium intake below 2,300 milligrams, and some suggest aiming for below 1,500 milligrams for optimal heart health, though that lower target isn't strictly necessary for the general population without hypertension.
And most people get way more than that already.
Way more, typically,
Yeah.
especially with processed foods. And studies have actually shown that habitually adding salt to your food at the table is associated with a higher risk of premature mortality and a lower life expectancy. So this recent push to consume more salt, often under the guise of optimizing electrolytes, is really quite concerning from a public health perspective.
So when we see popular YouTubers like, say, Logan Paul with his Prime drink, heavily marketed as a hydration or electrolyte drink, what's really going on there?
Well, it's essentially rebranding salt, or rather the concept of electrolytes, and selling it often at a premium price, frequently without the key components actually needed for rapid rehydration in athletic contexts. Prime, for example, markets itself as this ultimate hydration drink.
Right.
But if you look at the label, it has very little sodium compared to traditional sports drinks like Gatorade, and also very little sugar. As we just discussed, for rapid hydration during intense activity, you actually need both sugar and sodium to leverage those gut transporters effectively.
So Prime is missing the key ingredients for what it claims to do best.
Rapid rehydration during intense exercise, yes, its formulation is arguably suboptimal compared to a traditional oral rehydration solution or sports drink. It does have a lot of potassium, but the sodium and sugar are low. And often these drinks are very expensive, maybe $10 a bottle in some places, compared to $2.50 for a Gatorade. A lot of that cost differential is going into marketing, branding, and influencer deals, not necessarily into scientifically optimized formulations based on exercise physiology.
So it's another case of clever marketing, creating a perceived need and then selling a costly and maybe often unnecessary solution.
It certainly looks that way. It taps into that desire for an edge, for optimization. But the underlying science for the average person, or even for athletes in many situations, doesn't always support the hype or the price tag.
It's clear that while the allure of these quick fixes and, the charismatic experts selling them is strong, a deeper dive into the actual science often reveals a very different, sometimes disappointing story.
Absolutely.
This brings us to a fascinating and sometimes, let's be honest, frustrating area.
Yeah.
The expert trap. What happens when highly influential figures, even those with legitimate academic backgrounds, start getting things wrong? Or worse, start promoting products or ideas that seem to contradict their own stated science, maybe for profit. Let's talk about someone like Andrew Huberman.
Ah, yes.
He burst onto the podcast scene as this, plain-speaking Stanford professor, someone seemingly dedicated to giving people science-based tools for everyday life, often for free initially.
That's right. He was widely praised initially for his ability to distill complex scientific literature into actionable protocols. But as his popularity has absolutely exploded, some observers, myself included, would argue that the quality and scientific accuracy of some of his information has perhaps diminished. There seems to be a growing focus on, maximizing profit through sponsorships and product affiliations, sometimes potentially at the expense of truly accurate scientific dissemination.
And given his reach millions of viewers, that has a significant impact.
Huge impact.
Okay, let's start with an area where he should be an expert. Blue light blocking glasses. He's a tenured professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at Stanford, after all. What's the issue there?
This one is particularly, let's say, problematic. Back in 2021, he explicitly stated on his podcast that blue blockers generally aren't needed. He explained that bright lights of any color, not just blue, will activate the retinal cells that signal daytime to your brain and wake you up.
So brightness matters more than color, basically.
That was his point then. And there's also more recent research indicating that the amount of blue light emitted by our typical screens generally isn't bright enough to significantly affect circadian rhythms for most people anyway.
Okay, so what changed?
Well, more recently, he partnered with a brand called Roka, heavily promoting their blue light blocking glasses, which retail for over $100, sometimes much more. These glasses appear to be sourced from manufacturers in Asia, similar to much cheaper generic blue blockers you can find online.
Right.
This suggests a pretty clear profit motive, promoting a product that directly contradicts his own earlier scientific explanations and his specific area of expertise. It's a significant red flag regarding scientific integrity versus commercial interest.
Yeah, that's a huge inconsistency. Okay, what about his stance on melatonin? He often expresses a strong personal bias against using it. What are his reasons?
He raises a few points. He claims melatonin suppresses puberty, which isn't really relevant for the vast majority of his adult audience. He also claims it only helps you fall asleep, but not stay asleep, suggesting it might even cause waking up hours later. And he correctly points out that the dosage in commercial melatonin products can vary quite a bit from what's on the label.
Okay, are those claims accurate?
They are largely, let's say, misinterpretations or overstatements of the evidence. Firstly, extensive studies show melatonin is generally safe for use in children and does not substantially affect pubertal development at standard doses.
Good to know.
Secondly, numerous meta-analyses which combine data from many studies consistently show that melatonin does decrease the time it takes to fall asleep, sleep onset latency, does increase total sleep time, and does improve overall sleep quality for many people.
So it helps with staying asleep too.
Yes, the evidence points towards improving sleep duration and quality, not causing waking. And while the dosage variability in supplements is a real issue across the industry, it doesn't make melatonin itself inherently dangerous, especially since even very high doses used in some studies don't seem to shut down your body's own production. He tends to frame it as this risky substance when the totality of evidence suggests it's generally safe and effective for sleep issues for many adults.
So if he advises against melatonin, what does he recommend for sleep then?
He strongly promotes what he calls his sleep cocktail, a combination of magnesium threonate, apigenin from chamomile, and L-theanine.
Okay.
Now, coincidentally, or perhaps not so coincidentally, these are the exact three key ingredients in the Sleep Stack supplement sold by Momentous Labs, a company Huberman is heavily partnered with and promotes constantly.
Ah, and how does that stack compare in cost and effectiveness to melatonin?
Well, the Momentous Stack costs around $39 AUD for 60 servings. You can get a 90-day supply of standard melatonin for maybe $10, so you'd expect his recommended stack to be significantly better.
Right. You would, for that price difference.
But the evidence for its components is actually pretty weak, especially compared to melatonin. Systematic reviews show no consistent link between magnesium supplementation and sleep quality improvements in randomized controlled trials. Studies on chamomile extract, the source of apigenin, generally show no significant differences in sleep diary measures compared to placebo. And L-theanine. There are very few robust human studies showing it significantly improves sleep.
So they might help some people a little, but there's no strong evidence they're superior to melatonin.
Exactly. They may help some, as the research suggests, but they lack the substantial body of evidence that supports melatonin. Yet he promotes this expensive, sponsored stack while casting doubt on the cheap, effective, and generally safe alternative. Again, the pattern seems to lean towards promoting sponsored products over objective assessment of the science.
It certainly looks that way.
Yeah.
Okay, what about his advice on the flu vaccine? I recall him advising against getting it because he doesn't work in susceptible environments and claimed it's only like 40–60% effective anyway.
Yes, that advice demonstrated, frankly, a significant disregard for basic public health principles. His personal choice to not vaccinate because he doesn't work in susceptible environments completely ignores the concept of herd immunity.
Protecting others who are vulnerable.
Precisely. Vaccination isn't just about protecting yourself. It's about protecting vulnerable populations, the elderly, the immunocompromised, infants who rely on broader community immunity. And his dismissal based on a 40–60% effectiveness, well, nothing is 100% effective. Seatbelts aren't 100% effective. Airbags aren't.
Good point.
But flu shots significantly reduce the burden on the healthcare system. They reduce hospitalizations by around 50% and ICU admissions by about 80%, even if you do still happen to get infected with the flu. That's a massive impact.
So 40–60% effective against getting any illness doesn't capture the benefit against severe illness.
Exactly. And furthermore, vaccines typically create a broad polyclonal immune response. They don't just protect against the exact strains included in the vaccine. They often provide some cross-protection against related strains, too. His framing was overly simplistic and dismissive.
And didn't he omit vaccines entirely in an episode about preventing respiratory infections?
It's truly baffling. He did a 2-hour episode dedicated to preventing colds and flu, and he completely omitted mentioning masks or vaccines, arguably the most evidence-based public health interventions, while instead recommending things like, well, athletic greens for immune function.
Wow, that's a stark contrast to evidence-based public health recommendations. Okay, one more from him. On the exercise front, his claims about doing tibialis anterior raises, lifting your toes while your heels are down. He claimed it cured his sciatica and made him run like a beast with no knee, back, or even shoulder pain. What's the science on that?
His claims about tibialis anterior raises causing the specific effects are anatomically and physiologically incorrect to the point of being genuinely ridiculous.
Right.
The tibialis anterior muscle is in your shin. Crucially, it doesn't cross the knee joint. It primarily acts on the ankle to dorsiflex your foot, pull your toes up. It has absolutely no direct mechanical way to influence sciatica, which involves the sciatic nerve, usually originating in the lower back or buttocks, or knee pain unrelated to ankle function, and certainly not back pain or shoulder pain.
So it's anatomically impossible for that specific muscle exercise to fix those issues.
Directly, yes, essentially impossible. And his claim that it makes your calves bigger or stronger. Calf growth comes from targeting the actual calf muscles, the gastrocnemius and soleus, typically through exercises like calf raises. Strengthening the shin muscle won't grow your calves. His claims here are medically unsound and frankly mislead people about basic human anatomy and exercise physiology. It's really concerning when a figure with such a massive platform makes such demonstrably false statements.
It really undermines credibility, doesn't it? It's clear that even a Stanford professorship doesn't guarantee accurate or unbiased information, especially when commercial interests might be involved. This highlights the absolute importance of critical evaluation, regardless of the source's credentials.
Absolutely critical.
Now, this pattern of high-profile figures making questionable, often expensive, claims continues with someone like Brian Johnson. He's famous for spending a staggering $2 million a year on his Blueprint anti-aging protocol, claiming to have the best biomarkers on the planet.
Brian Johnson is an excellent, almost textbook case study for what's known as Goodhart's Law.
Which is?
Goodhart's Law basically states, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure.
Ah, okay. How did that apply here?
Johnson's entire focus seems to be obsessively optimizing every single biomarker he can measure. Everything from tracking his nocturnal erections and trying to improve them with shockwave therapy and Botox, seriously, to boosting his NAD levels via supplementation. He's constantly intervening to artificially enhance these specific numbers, these markers. But by doing so, by directly manipulating the measures themselves, he renders them unreliable indicators of his true underlying health or actual rate of aging. He's hitting the numbers on the dashboard, but that doesn't necessarily mean the engine is running better or will last longer.
All right. He's gaming the test, essentially, and he often showcases his best biomarkers from the last 24 months. Is that a fair or informative way to present data?
It's highly disingenuous, in my view. Biomarkers can fluctuate wildly, sometimes over very short periods. For example, someone's testosterone levels can plummet by 90% in just 5 days due to factors like intense fasting combined with running a marathon.
Oh, right.
So showing only the best results cherry-picked from a 2-year period gives a misleadingly optimistic picture and doesn't reflect true sustained health status. It smooths over all the variability and potential negative fluctuations.
And does he provide independent verification for these biomarker claims?
Not really. He never provides comprehensive, third-party verified lab test results to back up his claims publicly. It's largely just what he states his numbers are. And furthermore, when he uses exogenous hormones, like testosterone replacement therapy, which he has done, his blood levels of testosterone no longer accurately reflect his body's natural production or state. They just reflect the medication he's taking.
So the numbers are artificial in multiple ways. And his approach to interventions seems to involve throwing everything at the wall at once, right?
Yes, that's another major scientific flaw in his approach. He simultaneously tries hyperbaric oxygen therapy, stem cell treatments, experimental gene therapy, full-body shockwave therapy, drugs like rapamycin and acarbose, plasminogen infusions. The list is incredibly long and constantly changing.
The problem with that is?
When you implement dozens, maybe hundreds of interventions all at the same time, it becomes absolutely impossible to isolate what, if anything, is actually effective. You can't determine causality. It's like baking a cake with 100 ingredients and then insisting that the delicious result came only from the pinch of salt you added.
Right, you have no idea what actually worked, or if maybe some things are even counteracting others.
Exactly. The scientific method requires changing one variable at a time or using carefully controlled groups to assess the effect of an intervention. His everything, including the kitchen sink approach, completely abandons that fundamental principle.
That makes sense. But okay, forget his own results for a second. What about real-world results from other people who've actually tried to follow his blueprint protocol? Has anyone else seen these supposed amazing benefits?
Well, we have the case of Sierra Clark, who publicly documented following the exact blueprint protocol for 180 days. She measured her biological pace of aging using epigenetic clocks before and after.
Yeah.
Disappointingly, after 6 months on the blueprint, her measured pace of aging had actually increased slightly from 0.93 to 0.95. Not the result you'd hope for.
Definitely not. Any other examples?
Furthermore, there was a group Johnson himself founded called BP 5000, which aimed to study the blueprint supplement stack on thousands of people. It was apparently so badly managed that his own key supervising doctor quit the project. And maybe most tellingly, leaked Discord chat logs from within that group revealed there were 10 times more messages in the side effects discussion thread than in the glow up or positive results thread.
10 times more side effects reported than positive results. That's pretty damning.
Yeah.
What kind of side effects were people reporting?
A whole litany of issues: significant bloating, gas, constipation, headaches, persistent fatigue, increased anxiety, skin problems like rashes and acne, and sleep disturbances. Not exactly the picture of optimized health.
No kidding. Were there any other serious issues reported with his protocol or the products he promotes?
Yes, there were some quite concerning reports. For instance, it came out that his own blood test showed he had undetectable vitamin B12 levels for about 8 months while following his strict vegan diet.
Undetectable B12. That's dangerous, right?
Critically dangerous. B12 is essential for nerve function and producing red blood cells. Deficiency can lead to severe, irreversible neurological damage and anemia. It's something anyone on a strict vegan diet needs to be vigilant about supplementing, and somehow his hyper-monitored protocol missed this for months.
Wow. Anything else?
Additionally, some of his branded food products, like his nutty pudding and cacao powder, received official notices of violation under California's Proposition 65 Health and Safety Code due to containing extremely high levels of lead and cadmium.
Heavy metals in his health food.
Yes, lead and cadmium, both known toxins, were found at levels exceeding legal safety limits in products he was consuming daily and promoting to others.
That's alarming. And despite this incredibly elaborate, expensive, and data-driven protocol, how well does Johnson himself actually seem to understand the science behind it all?
This is another major red flag, in my opinion. When interviewed or asked questions about the specifics, Johnson often comes across less like a knowledgeable biohacker and more like a puppet, simply following the complex instructions laid out by his team of doctors and consultants, rather than genuinely understanding the underlying scientific literature or the mechanisms of action for the interventions he's undergoing.
Can you give an example?
When asked basic questions about why he takes certain supplements, like alpha-ketoglutarate, or how specific components of his diet, like his super veggie powder, are supposed to work, his frequent response is essentially, "I don't know, you'd have to ask my team." He even publicly misinterpreted a study preprint about the drug rapamycin, claiming it showed rapamycin accelerated aging when the study actually concluded it had a neutral effect in that context.
So a profound lack of personal understanding of his own multi-million-dollar experiment.
It certainly appears that way sometimes, and that lack of deep understanding really calls into question his legitimacy as a source of health information or guidance for others, particularly when he's spending so much money and encouraging others to emulate his extreme approach.
So Brian Johnson's blueprint sounds like a very expensive, scientifically questionable, largely ineffective for others, and potentially even harmful venture based on current evidence.
That seems a fair summary of the critiques.
Okay, now let's talk about another really influential figure in the biohacking world, someone often credited as the original fake natty biohacker, Dave Asprey. He's famous for bulletproof coffee and also claims to have spent millions to reverse his age, boasting low biological age and body fat percentages.
Dave Asprey is, yes, arguably the epitome of the fake natty biohacker.
Yeah.
He promotes his protocols and his physique as if they were achieved through his diet, his coffee, his supplements, natural means. But digging deeper reveals a significant reliance on exogenous hormones and prescription drugs.
What kind of things?
For example, he's admitted to taking thyroid hormone, likely T3, which can accelerate metabolism and aid weight loss but carries risks. He openly encourages men over 40 to consider testosterone replacement therapy, often framing it as essential, which contradicts standard medical guidelines unless there's diagnosed hypogonadism. He also promotes modafinil, a prescription drug for narcolepsy.
Right, a stimulant.
He calls it a vitamin and claims it reversed his supposed mold-induced toxic brain damage. This reliance on artificial hormones and powerful drugs fundamentally undermines the natural efficacy he claims for his lifestyle protocols. Using these substances suppresses your body's own natural production, essentially borrowing from future vitality, while he presents the results as achievable through just his diet and hacks.
So his impressive results might not be from his special coffee or diet, but from this hidden secret sauce of pharmacology.
It's highly likely that pharmacology plays a significant role he doesn't fully disclose when promoting his methods.
Okay, let's delve into his most famous invention then. Bulletproof coffee blended with butter and MCT oil. One of his core claims was that traditional coffee is contaminated with harmful mold toxins or mycotoxins. Is this actually a widespread problem?
Not really, no. He made dramatic claims like 70–80% of coffee beans being significantly moldy, but scientific reviews looking at mycotoxins in coffee found a generally low frequency of contamination, especially in beans destined for Western markets with stricter quality controls.
And doesn't roasting help?
Crucially, yes, the roasting process itself destroys the vast majority, maybe 70–80% or more, of any mycotoxins that might be present in the green beans. Joe Rogan actually famously had various bags of coffee tested, including Asprey's own expensive low-toxin brand, and they found no significant levels of mycotoxins in any of them.
So that whole mold toxin scare seems largely unfounded for typical coffee drinkers.
Largely, yes. It seems more like a marketing tactic to differentiate his own expensive brand. He also made this bizarre claim that needing to pee after drinking coffee is a sign your body is flushing out these kidney and bladder toxins from mold.
That sounds unlikely.
It's absurd. It's just basic physiology. Caffeine is a diuretic. It suppresses antidiuretic hormone, ADH, which tells your kidneys to reabsorb less water, leading to increased urination. It has absolutely nothing to do with flushing out non-existent mold toxins.
Okay. What about his other big claim for bulletproof coffee? Putting butter and oil in it helps you get into fat-burning mode and lose weight.
There is no magical fat-burning mode you enter by drinking fat. Weight loss fundamentally comes down to being in a caloric deficit, burning more calories than you consume.
And fat is very calorie-dense, right?
Okay. Incredibly calorie-dense. Fat has 9 calories per gram compared to just 4 calories per gram for carbohydrates and protein. Adding potentially hundreds of calories from butter and oil to your morning coffee makes achieving a caloric deficit much harder. Plus, consuming calories in liquid form, especially liquid fat, is generally less satiating than eating solid food, meaning you might feel hungrier sooner and eat more later in the day. For most people, bulletproof coffee is more likely to hinder weight loss than help it.
That makes sense calorically. Now, he's also a huge proponent of avoiding seed oils like soybean or canola oil, claiming the omega-6 fats in them slow metabolism and cause massive inflammation because they're unstable. He heavily promotes saturated fats like butter and coconut oil instead. What does the science say?
The science generally says the opposite. High-quality research, including randomized controlled trials, actually demonstrates that diets high in saturated fats tend to trigger higher levels of inflammatory markers in the blood compared to diets higher in polyunsaturated fats, like those found in many seed oils, or monounsaturated fats, like olive oil.
So saturated fat is more inflammatory.
The evidence points that way. And numerous RCTs have shown that replacing saturated fats with polyunsaturated fats tends to improve metabolic parameters. It can help reduce fat accumulation in the liver in cases of fatty liver disease. It's associated with reduced risk of coronary heart disease events, and it can even increase insulin sensitivity. His claims about seed oils being inherently inflammatory and metabolism slowing due to omega-6 content are not well supported by the balance of robust scientific evidence.
Okay, so another claim that seems counter to the evidence. What about his dismissal of common, often considered healthy, foods like oatmeal and brown rice? He calls them peasant food and claims they shred your gut.
Yeah, that's a combination of misinformation and, frankly, a bit of an appeal to snobbery, isn't it? Peasant food.
Seems like it. What's his issue with oatmeal?
He claims oatmeal sucks minerals out of your body because it contains phytic acid, and also that it spikes blood sugar more than ice cream.
More than ice cream. Seriously.
It's a ridiculous comparison. First, phytic acid. Yes, it's present in oats and other whole grains and legumes, and it can slightly limit the bioavailability of some minerals like iron and zinc in that specific meal. However, phytic acid also has significant health benefits of its own. It acts as an antioxidant, may help reduce the risk of certain cancers, supports heart health, and can help manage kidney stones. So it's not just a villain.
And the blood sugar claim.
Completely wrong. Research actually shows that the fiber and even the phytic acid in oatmeal help to slow down glucose absorption, leading to a lower, more stable blood sugar response compared to refined grains or sugary foods. Studies consistently link oat consumption, especially whole oats, with improved glycemic control in people with type 2 diabetes, reduced risk of developing type 2 diabetes, and improvements in blood lipid levels. Oats are generally a very healthy food.
Okay. And what about brown rice? He claims it's bad because of lectins and has 80 times more arsenic than white rice.
Again, misleading. While brown rice can have higher arsenic levels than white rice, because arsenic accumulates in the bran, which is removed in white rice, the 80 times figure is a huge exaggeration and depends heavily on where the rice is grown. Responsible sourcing and rinsing rice can mitigate this. More importantly, large-scale studies show that regular consumption of white rice is associated with a higher risk of developing type 2 diabetes, whereas consuming brown rice is linked to decreased body weight, improved lipid profiles, and better fasting blood glucose compared to white rice. The overall health profile of brown rice is generally considered superior due to its fiber and nutrient content, despite the lectin and arsenic concerns, which are often overblown.
So the evidence favors the peasant food again. Finally, let's touch on his advice on salt intake. He claims most people are probably not getting enough salt, and that the low government recommendations actually raise heart attack risk through renin. What's going on there?
This demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of cardiovascular physiology. Renin is an enzyme released by your kidneys primarily in response to low blood pressure or low salt levels. Its job is to initiate a cascade, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, that ultimately raises blood pressure back towards normal.
So renin goes up when blood pressure is low to fix it.
Exactly. Elevated renin levels in the blood are therefore often a marker of the body compensating for low pressure, or sometimes a sign of underlying issues. Critically, studies have actually linked chronically elevated renin levels themselves to higher cardiovascular mortality, not lower risk. Asprey seems to be conflating the body's normal physiological response to low salt, releasing renin, with that response causing disease, which is completely misinterpreting the system.
And of course, as we discussed earlier, excessively high salt intake definitely raises blood pressure and cardiovascular disease risk for most people.
Absolutely. The vast majority of people in developed countries get more than enough sodium, often far too much. His advice to consume more salt is generally counter to evidence-based guidelines for heart health. It's another example of contrarian advice that lacks solid scientific backing.
Wow. Okay, it's clear that navigating the claims of even the most popular health influencers requires a lot of critical thinking and fact-checking. We've seen how often the promise of a simple solution, a miracle supplement or a biohack, leads to complex problems, unsupported claims, and sometimes just bad advice.
It's a minefield out there.
So if these popular, often expensive approaches aren't necessarily the answer, what actually works? Where should people focus their efforts for genuine health and longevity? Let's shift our focus now to the fundamental principles that are backed by robust, consistent science.
This is where we can really distill the true actionable insights, I think, and perhaps the most fundamental guiding principle for health span and longevity boils down to two core things: optimizing your energy balance and ensuring sufficient protein intake.
Energy balance and protein. Seems simple.
It is, but it gets lost in all the noise. All the endless debates about the perfect diet, keto versus paleo versus vegan versus low fat. They often completely miss this fundamental point. Any diet, no matter how ideologically pure or well-intentioned, if it's consistently consumed in excess of your body's energy needs, will ultimately lead to poor metabolic health, primarily through fat accumulation.
So it's less about the specific type of food and more about the amount relative to your activity.
In terms of metabolic health and weight management, yes, energy balance is paramount. Think about it. What was the secret to health, say, 200 or 300 years ago, before modern processed food and sedentary lifestyles?
Less food, more movement.
Exactly. It's almost laughably simple. People generally had less access to abundant, calorie-dense food, and they were forced to move more just to live their daily lives. That's essentially the core secret to why obesity and metabolic diseases were rarer. Our bodies are adapted to conserve energy in times of scarcity, but in our modern environment of constant abundance, that same adaptation leads us to accumulate excess fat.
So bringing that principle to today, is calorie restriction the key?
Calorie restriction without malnutrition is consistently the most effective non-pharmacological intervention we know of for enhancing longevity and health span across many species, including strong indications in humans. Study after study shows that achieving and maintaining a healthy weight through managing energy balance leads to significant improvements in nearly all physiological markers of health and aging.
So it's not necessarily about being on a specific named diet, but about finding a sustainable way to match calorie intake to expenditure.
Precisely. Look at the DIFIT study from 2018. It was a large, year-long, randomized controlled trial comparing low-fat and low-carb diets. The result: both diets produced similar amounts of weight loss and similar improvements in metabolic health markers when caloric intake and, importantly, protein intake were kept similar between the groups.
So the best diet is.
The best diet is likely the one that you can personally stick to consistently over the long haul, while ensuring it controls calories appropriately and provides adequate nutrition, especially protein.
Okay, let's talk protein then. You mentioned it's critical. Why and how much?
Protein intake is absolutely crucial for several reasons. It's essential for building and repairing tissues, including muscle. It's also the most satiating macronutrient, meaning it helps you feel fuller for longer, which can be incredibly helpful when managing calorie intake. And preserving muscle mass is vital for metabolic health and functional ability as we age.
So what's the target range for protein intake?
The current evidence suggests that for optimal health, aiming for somewhere between 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of your body weight per day is a good target for most adults.
1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram.
Yes. And if you're actively trying to lose fat while preserving muscle, say, during a cutting phase, you might even want to aim a bit higher, perhaps closer to 2.2 grams per kilogram, or roughly 1 gram per pound of your target or lean body weight.
Okay, that's a clear guideline. So practically speaking, how can listeners start applying these principles, energy balance and protein, to their daily lives?
It starts with getting a rough idea of your energy needs. You can use an online TDEE, Total Daily Energy Expenditure calculator, to estimate your maintenance calories based on your age, sex, weight, height, and activity level. Then aim for a slight deficit if weight loss is a goal.
Okay, calculate your target calories.
Then make sure you're hitting your protein target within those calories. From there, it's about making smart food choices. Strategically reduce your intake of high-calorie, low-satiety foods, things like added oils, sugary drinks, refined snacks. Swap them for lower-calorie alternatives where possible, maybe powdered peanut butter instead of regular, using sugar-free condiments, choosing leaner cuts of meat.
Smart substitutions.
Exactly. And importantly, incorporate plenty of low-calorie, high-volume filling foods. Think big salads, lots of non-starchy vegetables, fruits, maybe adding things like chia seeds or psyllium husk for extra fiber and fullness. It's about structuring your diet to maximize satiety and nutrient density within your calorie budget.
That's a really clear, actionable roadmap for nutrition. Thank you. Now, let's talk about something else that consistently rises right to the very top as a predictor of longevity, often overshadowing almost everything else: cardiovascular fitness.
This is huge, absolutely huge. Your cardiovascular fitness, which is commonly measured by a metric called VO2 max, the maximum amount of oxygen your body can utilize during intense exercise, has the strongest correlation with all-cause mortality of almost any modifiable factor we know.
Stronger than smoking, stronger than diabetes.
Yes. The data is quite striking. It consistently beats out factors like smoking status, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, type 2 diabetes, and even most standard medical interventions as a predictor of how long and how healthily you'll live.
Wow. Can you put some numbers on that? How big is the difference?
To put it starkly, large studies have shown that someone in the bottom 20–25% category for cardiovascular fitness is roughly 4 times more likely to die from any cause compared to someone in the top 2.5% fitness category. 4 times.
4 times. That's an incredibly strong association. Is it just correlation, or do you think fitness causes longer life?
All the evidence strongly points towards a causal relationship. We can apply the Bradford Hill criteria for causation here. The strength of the association is massive. There's a clear biological gradient. As fitness increases, mortality risk consistently decreases. The finding is incredibly consistent across numerous large studies in diverse populations, and the biological plausibility, how fitness benefits nearly every system in the body, is undeniable. It's about as close to proving causation as you can get in human health studies outside of drug trials.
Okay, so getting fit is arguably one of the most powerful things you can do for longevity. How do we best train to improve our VO2 max and climb up those fitness percentiles? What's the most effective type of exercise?
The research here consistently points towards interval training being superior, specifically for boosting VO2 max compared to just doing long, slow-distance cardio or training only at your lactate threshold.
So high-intensity intervals.
Yes. Studies directly comparing different training protocols show that interval training thinks short, intense bursts, followed by recovery periods like maybe 15 seconds hard work, 15 seconds rest, or longer intervals like 4 minutes hard, 3 minutes, easy yields the most significant improvements in VO2 max. Steady state, lower intensities simply may not provide a strong enough stimulus to drive the necessary physiological adaptations in your heart, lungs, and muscles to maximally increase oxygen uptake.
Is there an optimal interval structure?
One highly effective and well-studied method is often called the Norwegian 4x4 method. This involves performing 4 sets of 4-minute high-intensity intervals.
4 minutes hard, 4 times. That sounds tough. How hard?
The goal is to be working at about 90–95% of your maximum heart rate during those 4-minute intervals, so really pushing yourself. Then you take 3 minutes of active recovery, like light jogging or cycling, in between each 4-minute hard interval.
And the goal is to reach what?
The goal during those intense bursts is essentially to reach aerobic failure by the end of the interval, meaning you feel like you couldn't sustain that intensity for much longer. That intense stimulus is what drives the adaptations that boost VO2 max, particularly improvements in stroke volume, how much blood your heart pumps per beat.
Okay, 4 by 4 at 90–95% max heart rate with 3-minute recovery. How often? And how long does it take to see results?
Typically, incorporating sessions like this maybe once or twice a week, alongside a base of lower intensity aerobic work, zone 2, is a good strategy. And consistency over the long term is absolutely key. While you might see some improvements sooner, studies suggest that training for longer durations, like greater than 12 weeks, generally leads to more pronounced and durable physiological adaptations.
Intense, but clearly effective for building that crucial cardiovascular engine. Now, let's switch gears slightly and talk about fat loss. There's often this debate about whether it's better to lose weight slowly and gradually, or if more aggressive, faster strategies can work. And people worry about aggressive fat loss, right? Concerns like it being harder to stick to, or leading to rapid weight regain, or even losing precious muscle mass.
Those are all very common and valid concerns that definitely need to be addressed by the evidence. Let's tackle them one by one. First, the idea that aggressive dieting is harder to stick to due to cravings.
Yeah. Seems logical. More restriction, more cravings.
Counterintuitively, some studies suggest the opposite might be true. Research looking at very low-calorie diets, VLCDs, has actually found that participants often report fewer cravings and less preoccupation with food compared to more moderate diets. One study even found that the more aggressive the initial calorie deficit, the greater the decrease in cravings participants reported.
Really? Why would that be?
The thinking is perhaps that a very low-calorie diet can induce ketosis more quickly, which can have an appetite-suppressing effect. Or maybe consolidating the suffering or restriction into a shorter, more intense period is psychologically easier for some people than dragging out moderate restriction for months or years. It might maximize long-term adherence by getting results faster.
Interesting. Okay, what about the concern that fast weight loss just leads to faster weight regain, the yo-yo effect?
Again, the evidence often defies that common belief. Several studies, including large meta-analyses, have found that individuals who achieve faster initial weight loss often have greater overall weight reduction and, crucially, better long-term weight maintenance compared to those who lose weight gradually.
Better long-term maintenance with faster loss. How much better?
One significant review found that rapid losers were actually 5.1 times more likely to achieve a clinically significant 10% weight loss at the 18-month follow-up point compared to gradual losers. The idea that slow and steady always wins the race isn't necessarily supported by the data on weight loss maintenance. Faster initial results can sometimes be more motivating and sustainable.
That's really surprising. Okay, the big one then, muscle loss. Doesn't aggressive dieting just burn through all your hard-earned muscle?
This is a critical point because the goal should always be fat loss, not just weight loss. And yes, very aggressive, poorly planned calorie restriction can lead to significant muscle loss. However, it is possible to lose fat quite rapidly while preserving the vast majority of your functional muscle tissue, the actual myofibrillar protein.
What's the strategy?
You need to be strategic. First, understand that some of the initial lean mass lost during aggressive dieting isn't actually muscle protein. It's primarily water and stored glycogen, which gets depleted when calories and carbs are low. To preserve the real muscle, two things are paramount: resistance training and adequate protein intake.
Okay, so how do you calculate a safe but aggressive rate of fat loss? And what does that strategic protocol look like?
There's a physiological limit to how quickly your body can release energy from fat stores. A commonly cited rule of thumb, based on research by Alpert, suggests the maximum fat you can lose per day is roughly related to your current body fat mass. A more practical guideline derived from this suggests a maximum safe weekly weight loss rate as a percentage of your total body weight might be roughly estimated by taking your current body fat percentage and dividing it by 13.
Okay, body fat percentage divided by 13. Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say someone has 26% body fat. Divide 26 by 13 and you get 2. So they could potentially aim to safely lose about 2% of their total body weight per week, with most of that being fat, assuming the protocol is set up correctly.
2% per week is pretty fast. How much of a calorie deficit does that require?
It requires a significant deficit.
Hmm.
Remember, 1 kilogram of body fat stores approximately 700 calories of energy. So, using our example, if that person weighs, say, 83 kilograms, about 183 pounds, losing 2% per week would be about 1.66 kilograms, 3.6 pounds. To achieve that purely from fat, they'd need a weekly calorie deficit of roughly 1.66 times 7,700, which is about 12,782 calories.
Well, that's a deficit of over 1,800 calories per day. How is that achievable without starving or losing muscle?
This is where the two levers approach comes in, combining diet and exercise strategically. Instead of trying to create that entire 1,800 calorie deficit just by slashing food intake way down, which would likely be miserable and risk muscle loss, you split the difference.
Russell.
Maybe you aim for a 900 calorie deficit from your diet, eating 900 calories below your maintenance level. And then you create the other 900 calorie deficit through increasing your energy expenditure via exercise.
900 calories burned through exercise. What kind of exercise?
To burn 900 calories requires a substantial amount of activity. It could be something like walking around 18,000 steps a day, or perhaps spending about 1 hour and 45 minutes on a Stairmaster at a moderate intensity. The key here is the intensity of the cardio used for creating the deficit.
Why does intensity matter? Shouldn't you just go as hard as possible?
Not necessarily for maximizing fat burning and minimizing muscle loss during a deficit. Research suggests that fat oxidation, burning fat for fuel, is actually optimized at more moderate aerobic intensities, typically somewhere between 45% to 65% of your VO2 max. Think brisk walking, slow jogging, or steady-state cycling or Stairmaster. Very high-intensity exercise relies more on carbohydrates for fuel and can also significantly increase appetite, making dietary adherence harder.
Okay, so moderate intensity cardio for the calorie burn. And what about the resistance training to keep the muscle?
Absolutely crucial. Continue lifting weights, focusing on heavy compound movements, maybe 2 to 3 times per week. The key during an aggressive cut is to maintain the intensity, the weight on the bar, as much as possible, but significantly reduce the volume, fewer sets and reps. Maybe doing 2 hard sets per exercise instead of your usual 3 or 4. This signals to your body that the muscle is still needed.
Preserve intensity, drop volume,
Got it.
and protein intake.
Critically important, as we discussed. During an aggressive deficit, aim for the higher end of the protein recommendations, perhaps even 2.3 to 3.1 grams per kilogram of your fat-free mass daily. This provides the building blocks to repair muscle tissue and helps spare it from being broken down for energy.
So it is possible to do aggressive fat loss strategically without wrecking your metabolism or losing all your muscle.
Yes, with careful planning, focusing on protein, resistance training, and managing the deficit through both diet and moderate intensity exercise, even short, aggressive cuts like this can be highly effective and can then be followed by periods of maintenance or slow bulking, making the overall long-term process potentially more efficient and sustainable for some individuals compared to perpetual slow dieting. It all comes back to managing overall energy balance effectively.
That's a really comprehensive and evidence-based look at aggressive fat loss. Very helpful. Okay, let's tackle another topic that's often filled with controversy and misinformation, especially online. LDL cholesterol. We constantly hear claims, particularly from carnivore or keto communities, that LDL is harmless, that it's not causal in heart disease, or that it's only bad if you're metabolically unwell otherwise.
Yes, this is an area where there's a profound amount of misinformation circulating, which is deeply concerning given that cardiovascular disease is the leading cause of death globally. The arguments you mentioned are common tropes.
Let's break them down. What about the claim that LDL isn't causal, maybe just a correlation?
This is unequivocally false based on decades of overwhelming scientific evidence. The idea that LDL cholesterol is merely an innocent bystander or just correlated with heart disease, rather than being a direct cause of atherosclerosis, the buildup of plaque in arteries, has been thoroughly debunked.
How so? What's the evidence?
We have multiple converging lines of evidence. First, observational studies consistently show a strong graded relationship. The higher your LDL cholesterol levels over time, the higher your risk of heart attack and stroke. Second, genetic studies, particularly Mendelian randomization studies,
Those.
they use naturally occurring genetic variations that lead to lifelong lower or higher LDL levels, kind of like a natural randomized trial. These studies consistently show that genetic variants leading to lower LDL cause significantly lower rates of heart disease, and variants leading to higher LDL cause higher rates. This strongly implies causality.
Okay, genetic evidence points to causation. What else?
We have mechanistic studies showing exactly how LDL particles penetrate the artery wall, get modified, trigger inflammation, and lead to plaque formation. We understand the biological process, and perhaps most importantly, we have numerous large-scale, long-term randomized controlled trials, RCTs, the gold standard of medical evidence.
The drug trials.
Yes, trials using various classes of drugs, statins, ezetimibe, PCSK9 inhibitors, that have different mechanisms but all effectively lower LDL cholesterol. These RCTs, conducted over decades in hundreds of thousands of people across the globe.
And the results?
They consistently and unequivocally show that lowering LDL cholesterol directly reduces the risk of cardiovascular events like heart attacks and strokes, typically by about 15% to 35% or more, depending on the amount of LDL reduction and the duration. The evidence is overwhelming and meets all criteria for establishing causality. It is not scientifically debatable anymore.
So the idea that LDL isn't causal is just wrong.
Simply put, yes, it ignores a mountain of high-quality scientific evidence.
What about the other claims? Like LDL is only bad if you also have low HDL, good cholesterol, or high triglycerides or insulin resistance, that it's harmless in metabolically healthy people.
This is another common piece of misinformation. While having other risk factors like low HDL, high triglycerides, or diabetes certainly increases your overall cardiovascular risk alongside high LDL, the evidence clearly shows that LDL cholesterol is an independent risk factor. High LDL increases risk even in people who are otherwise metabolically healthy with normal HDL and triglycerides. The Framingham Heart Study and countless other large cohort studies and RCTs confirm this. LDL drives atherosclerosis regardless of the metabolic background, although the process might be accelerated by other risk factors.
And the idea that raising HDL cholesterol is protective.
That was a hope for a long time, but large clinical trials testing drugs designed specifically to raise HDL levels have unfortunately failed to show any reduction in cardiovascular risk. This further reinforces that LDL is the primary driver, and simply manipulating HDL isn't the answer. Focus needs to remain on lowering LDL.
Okay, that's very clear. What about the argument that LDL is essential for life, so high levels can't be bad, or that LDL goes up during fasting, proving it's beneficial?
These are flawed arguments based on confusing normal physiology with pathology. Yes, LDL cholesterol is absolutely essential. It transports cholesterol needed for cell membranes, hormones, etc. But like glucose, which is also essential, chronically high levels become pathological. Diabetes isn't caused by glucose being bad. It's caused by having too much glucose in the blood chronically. Same principle applies to LDL.
And the fasting argument.
LDL levels can temporarily increase during prolonged fasting or very low-carb diets as the body mobilizes fat stores. This is a normal physiological fluctuation, part of a dynamic process. It's completely different from having persistently high LDL levels day in, day out for years or decades, which is what drives atherosclerosis. It's like saying exercise is bad because your blood pressure goes up while you're doing it. You can't confuse an acute physiological response with a chronic pathological state.
Okay, the evidence for LDL being causal seems ironclad. So, given this, what are the effective solutions for managing high LDL cholesterol?
You really have two main categories of solutions: non-pharmacological lifestyle and pharmacological medication.
Let's start with lifestyle. What works best according to the evidence?
The primary dietary factor that raises LDL cholesterol is saturated fat intake. Not dietary cholesterol itself, as was previously thought. The link there is much weaker for most people. It's primarily the amount and type of fat you eat.
So reducing saturated fat is key. Does that mean avoiding all animal foods?
Not necessarily. It's about making smart choices. You can certainly manage LDL on a diet, including animal foods, by focusing on lean protein sources, things like poultry breast without the skin, fish, low-fat dairy like yogurt or cottage cheese, egg whites, and even very lean cuts of red meat like sirloin tip or kangaroo if that's available to you. These provide high-quality protein with relatively low amounts of saturated fat. The goal is generally to keep saturated fat intake low, often recommended to be less than 6–7% of your total daily calories by organizations like the American Heart Association. Increasing soluble fiber intake from oats, beans, psyllium also helps lower LDL.
Okay, so dietary changes focusing on reducing saturated fat and increasing soluble fiber. What about when lifestyle isn't enough? Or for people with genetically high LDL?
That's where pharmacological options come in, and they can be incredibly effective and life-saving. For individuals with familial hypercholesterolemia, genetically very high LDL, or those who can't reach their LDL targets through lifestyle alone, medications like statins are the first-line treatment.
Statins get a lot of bad press online, too. Are they safe and effective?
Statins are among the most well-studied classes of drugs in history. While, like any medication, they can have side effects in some individuals, muscle aches being the most commonly reported, though often not actually caused by the statin in blinded trials, they are generally very safe and remarkably effective at lowering LDL cholesterol and, consequently, significantly reducing the risk of heart attacks, strokes, and death. For the vast majority of people who need them, the benefits far outweigh the risks. Other drug classes like ezetimibe or PCSK9 inhibitors are also available if statins aren't sufficient or tolerated.
So medication can be a crucial tool, especially for high-risk individuals, allowing them to manage their cardiovascular risk effectively.
Absolutely. It's about using all the evidence-based tools available, both lifestyle and medical when necessary, to address a critical causal risk factor for the world's biggest killer. Ignoring high LDL cholesterol based on online misinformation is playing Russian roulette with your health.
That clarifies a lot on a really important, often confusing topic. Thank you. Now, for something that has historically been viewed with a bit of caution, maybe even advised against by doctors in the past, but it's surprisingly turning out to be a major ally for longevity in recent research, coffee.
Yes, coffee. It's had a fascinating journey in health perception. For years, many health practitioners did advise against it, especially for people with high blood pressure or heart conditions, often due to concerns about caffeine causing palpitations or temporary blood pressure
Oh, I
spikes.
remember hearing that.
However, large-scale, long-term observational studies conducted over the past couple of decades have not only largely demonstrated its safety for most people, but have also revealed significant beneficial effects associated with regular consumption. In fact, some major meta-analyses have linked regular coffee consumption with up to a remarkable 32% reduction in all-cause mortality.
32% lower risk of dying from any cause. That's a huge number. How does it impact the major killers, specifically things like cardiovascular disease and stroke?
For cardiovascular disease and stroke, the relationship appears to be U-shaped, or maybe J-shaped, meaning that moderate consumption seems to be most beneficial. Typically, drinking around 2 to 3 standard cups of coffee per day is associated with the lowest risk of developing cardiovascular disease, heart failure, coronary heart disease, and stroke compared to non-drinkers. Both very low and very high consumption seem to have slightly less benefit, but moderate intake looks protective.
Interesting. Do we know why? What are the mechanisms?
The proposed mechanisms are multifaceted. Caffeine itself might play a role by increasing the release of nitric oxide in blood vessels, which helps them relax and improves blood flow. Coffee also contains hundreds of other bioactive compounds, including powerful antioxidants like polyphenols and chlorogenic acids. These compounds are thought to reduce inflammation, improve insulin sensitivity, and potentially reduce lipogenesis, the creation of fat.
Okay, so benefits for the heart. What about cancer? Any links there?
The evidence is strongest for colorectal cancer. Several studies and meta-analyses have found that higher coffee consumption, sometimes especially more than 4 cups per day, is associated with a significantly lower risk of developing colorectal cancer and even a lower risk of recurrence in those who've had it, potentially around a 32% lower risk.
Why colorectal cancer specifically?
Again, it's likely due to a combination of factors. Coffee's anti-inflammatory and antioxidant properties, potential anti-proliferative effects on cancer cells, positive modulation of the gut microbiome, and improved insulin sensitivity, all of which are relevant to colorectal cancer development. The evidence for other cancers is generally less consistent, though some studies suggest potential benefits for liver and endometrial cancer, too.
Okay. And what about neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's? Coffee often gets touted for brain health.
Yes, there's quite a bit of research there. For Alzheimer's disease, many observational studies do suggest a protective effect, linking higher coffee intake in midlife to lower risk later on. However, it's important to take this with a grain of salt. These are observational studies prone to confounding. For example, maybe people who are developing early cognitive decline simply lose interest in novel things like drinking coffee. So correlation isn't definitively causation here yet.
Okay, suggestive but not conclusive for Alzheimer's. What about Parkinson's?
For Parkinson's disease, the evidence is actually quite a bit stronger and more consistent. Large meta-analyses show a clear inverse dose-response relationship. The more coffee people drink, up to a certain point, the lower their risk of developing Parkinson's. The maximum protection seems to be observed at around 3 cups per day.
And do we know why coffee might protect against Parkinson's?
The leading hypothesis centers on caffeine. Parkinson's involves the loss of dopamine-producing neurons in the brain. Caffeine acts as an antagonist, a blocker, for adenosine receptors in the brain. Adenosine normally inhibits dopamine release, so by blocking adenosine, caffeine may indirectly help maintain dopamine signaling and protect those vulnerable neurons.
Fascinating mechanism. Okay, one more major killer. Type 2 diabetes. Any link with coffee?
Yes, a very strong inverse relationship here too. Meta-analyses show an almost linear reduction in risk. Every additional cup of coffee consumed per day is associated with approximately a 7% reduction in the excess risk of developing type 2 diabetes.
Every cup adds up. Is that just the caffeine or other components too?
It's likely due to the combined effects of various components in coffee, not just caffeine. Decaffeinated coffee shows a similar, albeit slightly weaker, protective effect. Compounds like chlorogenic acids, lignans, and even the magnesium content in coffee are thought to contribute by improving glucose metabolism, increasing insulin sensitivity, and reducing inflammation.
So overall, it looks like coffee, particularly unsweetened coffee consumed in moderation, maybe 2 or 4 cups a day, genuinely emerges from the research as a surprising but potent ally for health span and longevity.
Based on the current large body of observational evidence, yes, that seems to be a fair conclusion. It impacts several major pathways related to aging and chronic disease in a positive way for most people.
That's a really compelling case for enjoying that morning cup. Okay, so if expensive supplements and extreme celebrity biohacking often aren't the answer, and these fundamental principles, energy balance, protein, VO2 max, managing LDL, maybe drinking coffee truly work, how does a real-world longevity blueprint actually look in action? Let's try to contrast some philosophies and see what the genuinely successful, maybe less famous people are doing.
It's a powerful contrast to draw. On one extreme, you have someone like Brian Johnson, spending that $2 million a year on a highly complex, extreme, often scientifically questionable, and seemingly ineffective protocol for others who try it.
Right, the extreme end.
Then, consider someone like Julie Gibson Clark. She's a 55-year-old single mom who gained some attention for achieving a slower measured pace of aging on epigenetic tests than Brian Johnson, but reportedly at just 0.1% of his cost, maybe around $2,400 a year.
Wow, 0.1% of the cost for potentially better results? What's she doing differently?
Well, she's not vegan. She doesn't take hundreds of supplements. She works a normal job. Her approach seems incredibly grounded and attainable, focusing on those fundamentals we've been discussing.
Okay, and maybe one more example.
Then there's someone like David Pascoe, a 62-year-old man profiled for having a measured biological age closer to 38. He reportedly spends around $30,000 a year, still a lot, but far less than Johnson, and his focus also seems to be primarily on nailing the fundamentals. Diet, exercise, sleep, stress management, but in a way that allows him to enjoy his life, not extreme calorie restriction or hundreds of pills.
So across these examples of people who seem to be genuinely achieving a remarkable health span, irrespective of their budget, what are the shared fundamentals? It sounds like the 80-20 rule really applies here, doesn't it? The core things that give the biggest results.
Exactly. The core 20% of actions that likely yield 80% or more of the results seem to consistently be those foundational pillars: sleep optimization, strategic diet, and consistent, smart exercise. These individuals, like Julie and David, don't appear to get lost in the weeds chasing every tiny optimization or expensive biohack. They focus on getting these big rocks in place consistently.
Okay, let's break down those big rocks, starting with exercise. How do they maintain consistency, which is often the hardest part, and how do they optimize their training?
They seem to employ clever psychological hacks, much like the principles outlined in books like James Clear's Atomic Habits, to build consistency. Julie Gibson Clark, for instance, reportedly uses temptation bundling.
Temptation bundling. What's that?
It's linking an activity you want to do with an activity you need to do. In her case, she apparently loves going to the sauna, so she bundles it. She only allows herself to go to the sauna, the want, after she's gone to the gym, the need.
Ah, linking the reward directly to the habit. Smart.
Very smart. And the sauna itself has significant health benefits, by the way. Studies show frequent sauna use, maybe 4 to 7 times a week, is associated with dramatically lower risk of fatal cardiovascular events, like a 63% lower risk of sudden cardiac death. So the reward itself is healthy.
Double win. Any other hacks for consistency?
Julie also apparently uses the 2-minute rule. To overcome inertia, she just tells herself she only has to go to the gym and do just one set. That makes the initial step incredibly easy, but once she's there and does that one set, the momentum usually carries her through the full workout.
Making it easy to start is key. Okay, so they get consistency. What about the structure of their training? Is it just random workouts?
No, it seems quite structured, often following principles recommended by longevity experts like Dr. Peter Attia. They focus on building both a large aerobic base, often called Zone 2 training, and a strong anaerobic peak, VO2 max. Attia uses the analogy of a pyramid. You need a wide, stable base and a high peak.
How does that look practically?
Julie, for example, reportedly dedicates about 3 days a week to Zone 2 cardio, that steady-state, lower-intensity work where you can hold a conversation. Then she adds 1 day of high-intensity VO2 max training using that Norwegian 4x4 method we discussed earlier. She strategically places that intense session on a Monday, presumably after resting and refueling over the weekend.
Zone 2 base, VO2 max peak. Makes sense. And strength training.
Absolutely essential. Both Julie and David incorporate strength training, maybe 2 days a week, using a mix of free weights and machines. This isn't just for looking good. Muscular strength itself is strongly and independently correlated with reduced risk of all-cause mortality, cancer mortality, and cardiovascular disease. Maintaining muscle mass and strength is critical for longevity.
Okay, solid exercise plan. Moving on to strategic nutrition. What are some of the key elements they seem to integrate beyond just energy balance and protein?
One crucial commonality that stands out, particularly between Julie and David Pascoe, is eating an early dinner or practicing some form of time-restricted feeding where the eating window ends relatively early in the evening, maybe by 5 or 6 p.m.
Why is eating early so important?
Finishing your last meal several hours before bed allows your food to digest properly. This helps lower your core body temperature overnight, which is critical for deep restorative sleep. It also aligns your food intake better with your body's natural circadian rhythms. Your metabolism is generally more efficient earlier in the day. This practice seems to significantly improve both sleep quality and metabolic health markers like insulin sensitivity.
So finishing eating early is a big lever for sleep and metabolism. What other nutritional strategies stand out?
Julie reportedly incorporates green tea regularly, which is rich in catechins like EGCG, known to potentially help reduce visceral fat. She also uses chlorella, a type of algae which some studies suggest can help reduce total cholesterol, LDL, blood pressure, and fasting blood glucose.
Interesting additions. But what about specific whole foods they prioritize?
They emphasize nutrient-dense whole foods. David Pascoe, for instance, includes things like green bananas, a source of resistant starch, good for gut health, and nuts. Frequent nut consumption, maybe more than 7 times a week, is strongly linked in studies to significant reductions in mortality risk, around 20%. Both emphasize eating a wide diversity of vegetables.
Good diversity. What about protein sources?
Yeah.
Seafood, meat.
David Pascoe incorporates a variety of seafood known to be rich in omega-3s, things like sardines, mussels, oysters, mackerel, shrimp. There's a clear inverse relationship in studies between fish consumption and all-cause mortality, maybe around a 12% reduction in total death risk for consuming about 60 grams per day, likely due to the beneficial effects of omega-3 fatty acids. For meat, David reportedly consumes it, but proportionately less than other components of his diet, focusing on high-quality sources, organic, grass-fed, free-range, and healthier cooking methods like slow cooking, grilling, or pressure cooking rather than frying, which can create harmful compounds.
Mindful meat consumption. Okay.
Yeah.
And finally, the third pillar, sleep hygiene and aids. A good night's sleep seems paramount for recovery and overall health, right? What are the key practices there?
Absolutely critical. Beyond the huge impact of finishing dinner early, they employ various other strategies. David Pascoe seems to leverage technology quite effectively. He uses automated blinds to control light exposure, Philips Hue smart lights programmed to emit only red spectrum light in the evenings, avoiding blue light that suppresses melatonin, and ensures blue light filters are active on all his screens.
Using tech to support circadian rhythm. Clever. Anything more unusual?
Interestingly, David Pascoe also reported eating 2 kiwi fruits after dinner. This sounds quirky, but there's actually research supporting it. Studies have found that consuming 2 kiwis about an hour before bed led to clinically significant improvements in sleep onset latency, total sleep time, and sleep efficiency.
Kiwi fruit for sleep. Why?
The thinking is it might be due to their relatively high serotonin content, a precursor to melatonin, or their antioxidant properties. It's a simple evidence-based food hack.
Amazing. And Julie, more low tech.
Julie seems to rely on the fundamentals, using a good sleep mask to ensure complete darkness, mouth taping, which can help encourage nasal breathing and improve sleep quality for some people, and maintaining a very consistent bedtime and wake time, even on weekends. These aren't necessarily complex or expensive biohacks, but rather the disciplined, consistent application of fundamental sleep hygiene principles.
It really seems to boil down to that, doesn't it? Consistent application of the fundamentals. This has been an absolutely incredible deep dive, pulling back the curtain on so much of the health hype and misinformation out there.
It's been fascinating to unpack it all.
We've journeyed through this overwhelming landscape of health claims, from those seemingly simple diet fads and incredibly expensive supplements, all the way to the sometimes questionable advice of highly visible influencers. And what we've seen, I think, pretty consistently is that while the promise of that quick fix, that miracle cure, is incredibly alluring,
Always tempting.
the real science, the solid evidence, often points towards something far simpler, more fundamental, and ultimately far more effective and sustainable in the long run.
Absolutely. And hopefully you, listening, now have some concrete examples, backed by robust scientific evidence, to help you look beyond the hype. Instead of feeling like you need to chase every new buzzword, every expensive product, every influencer trend,
Yeah.
you can feel empowered to focus your energy on those core pillars that truly move the needle for your health span. Things like optimizing your energy balance, that crucial equilibrium between calorie intake and output, prioritizing sufficient protein intake for satiety and muscle maintenance, embracing effective training like high-intensity intervals for superior cardiovascular fitness,
Yeah.
understanding the unequivocal causal role of LDL cholesterol in heart disease and managing it appropriately, and meticulously honing your sleep hygiene. These aren't glamorous hidden secrets. They are the bedrock of true, lasting health.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Perhaps the most powerful biohack of all isn't actually found in a pill or an expensive gadget or an extreme protocol. Maybe it's found in the disciplined, consistent application of these fundamental principles we've discussed today. And this maybe raises an important question for you to consider as we wrap up. What seemingly complex piece of health advice that you've heard might actually be rooted in a simple, fundamental truth that you're now ready and equipped to unlock for yourself.